la reforma cristiana. The reformation of Christianity. Okay, let's see if we can finish this chapter. So this is the last section that you need in order to complete your mind map. Okay, so let's try to complete this. Now, I think in the last chapter I stopped because I wanted to talk about this character. His name is King Henry. Okay, why he is very important in this Reformation? Why? Okay, I'm gonna tell you why. Okay, in England, the major figure of the Reformation was Henry VIII, Enrique VIII, el rey Enrique VIII, because he has no son. Ese es el problema, que no tenía hijos, and his wife couldn't have any child, y no podía tener hijos la esposa. Y así tenía que pedirle permiso al Papa para poder que te pida, te concediera el divorcio y entonces pudiera casarse. Pero según la iglesia en aquel entonces era difícil, ¿ya? Entonces, ¿qué pasó? Henry wanted to get married again so that he could have a son to whom he could leave his throne. Pero el Papa de aquel entonces dijo que no. The Pope refused Henry's request. Furious, Henry decided that he didn't want to obey the Pope. And in 1534, he declared himself the head of the church, ¿a dónde? En Inglaterra, called the Church of England. Y eso se formó entonces en la iglesia anglicana, the Anglican Church. Yo estoy seguro que ustedes han escuchado la iglesia anglicana. Bueno, pues ahí nació la iglesia anglicana. ¿Y quién la inició? ¿Cómo se llama? Enrique VIII. ¿Por qué? Porque no se quería, el Papa no le permitió que se divorciara para que se casara, porque él quería dejar herederos. Entonces, por eso mismo, en 1534, ¿ok? Now, the main Catholic reforms emerged in response of the Reformation, the Catholic Reformation. Now, aquí comienza la reforma de la Iglesia Católica. By the mid-1500, Catholic leaders in Europe were responding to the criticism. Como vieron que todo el mundo estaba molesto y quería una reforma íntegra de la Iglesia Católica, entonces ya ellos accedieron. Okay, they responded in many ways. Some reform created new religious order. Entonces ellos crearon un orden religioso diferente. ¿Y la primera orden era de los San Ignacio y Loyola, que comenzó la primera, que eran los jesuitas. No sé si ustedes habrán escuchado los jesuitas. Y aquí en América vinieron muchos jesuitas en la época de la colonia. Cuando vino Cristóbal Colón y colonizaron América, bueno, vinieron muchos jesuitas para instaurar la Iglesia Católica aquí. Ahí aparecen los jesuitas que llegan a América, entonces. The new order was founded in 1534 by a Spanish noble, Ignacio de Loyola. This new order was the Society of Jesus, una sociedad de Jesús, o the Jesuitas. Ignatius came from the noble Spanish family and became a knight as a young man, convirtió un caballero como cuando era joven. Okay. Ahí vienen los jesuitas que vinieron acá, invadieron toda América. When he reformed the Jesuits, Ignatius used his military experience, porque él peleó en las batallas en España, entonces con su experiencia él organizaba todo lo que era en la iglesia. So he led the group as superior general and insisted that his followers be well trained, like soldiers. He thought this would make them better able to fight against the spread of the Protestants. Acuérdense que están luchando en contra del protestantismo. Okay, entonces, por eso que la iglesia decidió crear esta nueva orden. Esta niña que acaba de llegar. Bueno, no importa, después ya la veo. No, entonces apareció un concilio. El concilio es una especie de una reunión de todos los representantes de la iglesia para tratar de hacer una reforma más fuerte o más formal en la iglesia en aquella época. The new religious order were one response to reform, but many Catholic leaders thought that more changes was needed. They decided to call together to a council church leaders que se reunieron. Held in Trent, y se le llamó el Concilio de Trent porque fue en Trent, en Italia. This council was called the Council of Trent. Esto es muy famoso. At this meeting, clergy from across Europe came together to discuss, debate, and eventually reform Catholic teachings. Acuérdense que todo esto era porque apareció la iglesia, las protestantes. De Martín Lutero, acuérdense. The council restated the importance of clergy and interpreting the Bible. But it created new rules that clergy had to follow. For example, the council ordered bishops to actually live in the area of oversaw. O sea, que tenían que vivir en esa área para que supervisar. Oversaw es supervisar. Tienes a los bishops. Okay? The Council of Trent endorsed Catholic teachings and instituted reform in Catholic practices. For this point on, there was a clear distinction between Catholic and Protestant beliefs and practice. Now, missionaries and spread Catholic teaching. Ahí salieron los misionarios para, aquí cuando vino Cristóbal Colón, llegó a esta área, comenzaron a distribuir toda a esparcir la iglesia católica. La iglesia católica sí, en toda América. Aquí la ruta de los celestes, los españoles, los portugueses acá, que ellos invadieron esta área por acá de África y esparcieron los franceses. En esta área de acá, acuérdense que en Canadá hay un área que es francesa y hablan francés. Creo que es en Ottawa, no en Ottawa, no. Sí, la capital de Canadá, en Ottawa, ellos hablan francés ahí. Missionaries spread the teaching. Rather than church, many Catholics decided to dedicate their lives to helping to grow. New became missionaries. Their goal was teaching Catholic around the world. Querían distribuir el catolicismo por toda el área. Dice división de las religiones. At the beginning of 1500, nearly all of Europe was Catholic. Casi todos eran católicos. As you can see in the map, over here en el map vemos. Solamente los amarillos aquí dicen protestantes. Estos eran protestantes, los demás eran católicos. Ortodoxos eran esta área de acá. Y esta área era católica. Celeste dice musulmanes porque parece que fueron invadidos por los musulmanes por acá. ¿Ya? Esa la idea era tratar de que todo fuese católico. ¿Ya? No, pero comenzó una guerra entre los católicos y los protestantes. Ahí murieron muchos seguidores en la iglesia protestante murieron mucho y muchos católicos murieron, dice. Violence and disagreements about religion often went hand in hand. During the Reformation, this violence was sometimes tied to political concern. Although most people in France remained Catholic, some became Protestant. French Protestants were called Huguenots. Los protestantes se llamaron los Huguenots en el área de Francia, en Francia, los Huguenots. As a series of conflict between Catholic and Huguenots led to year of bloody wars. The worst incident in the war was in San Bartolomeo's days, la masacre de San Bartolomeo's. It took place in August 24, 1572, which Catholics called San Bartolomeo's days. In one night, Catholic rioters killed about 3,000 protestants. Imagínense, murieron 3,000 protestantes. ¿Dónde? En París. Entonces la iglesia reaccionó. Esta es una foto de aquel incidente. Entonces reaccionó la iglesia y entonces the religion was caused even more destructions in the Holy Roman Empire than in France. Major violence there broken in 1618 when unhappy Protestant threw 2 Catholic officials out of window in the city of Prague. Imagínense. Dice, unhappy Protestant threw 2 Catholic officials out of the window. Tiraron por la ventana en Praga. The revolution spread into other part of empire. This rebellion began what is known as the 30 years of war. 30 años de esta rebelión se comenzó. Después de que murieron los otros 3,000, ¿se acuerdan? Se formó una guerra de 30 años, dice. The 30 years of war, along a series of war involved many of countries Europe. Imagínense, los ahorcaban así. Los ahorcaban y los ponían aquí en árboles. Porque eran, pienso yo que eran protestantes. La mayoría son católicos, o puede ser al revés también. No, entonces por eso mismo, ¿qué sucedió? Tuvieron que hacer se reunieron todas las iglesias e hicieron un tratado que se llamó el Tratado of Westphalia. The agreement they create, the Treaty of Westphalia, allowed rulers to determine whether their country would be Catholic or Protestant. ¿En qué consistía? Que le daban el permiso a que los que gobernaban esa área decidiesen si van a ser católicos o van a ser protestantes. Esa fue la solución que encontraron en aquel entonces. Definitivamente esto hizo muchos cambios en la sociedad y se formaron congregaciones, las cuales entonces, cuando la iglesia le dieron el poder para que ellos decidieran si iban a ser católicos o protestantes, entonces surgió lo que eran las congregaciones y las federaciones. Entonces ya ellos quisieron envolverse en las actividades del mismo Estado y querían formar sus propias repúblicas dentro del Estado. The new view of the world. Entonces ya vinieron una nueva vista en cómo era el mundo, dice. Once people began to think that their own ideas were important, they began to ask more questions. They wanted to know more about the natural physical world around them. In addition, more and more people refused to accept information about the world based on someone else's authority. So cada uno quiso decidir lo suyo. They didn't care if the person was a writer from ancient Greek or religious leader. The desire to investigate, to figure things out on their own, led people to turn increasingly in science. Entonces aquí viene el capítulo donde vamos a hablar, donde aparecieron muchas investigaciones, muchas ciencias, todo avanzó en el capítulo que sigue después de este. Ok, vamos a parar aquí y le voy a poner un video que habla sobre la más resumida. Ok, chicos, déjenme ver si lo tengo por aquí. The Council of Trent and the War. Vamos a ponerme esta, la de la guerra. The War of 30 years. Vamos a poner.
During the 16th century, the Reformation had been dividing the Holy Roman Empire, and although Lutherans had been officially recognized in 1555, the many Calvinist rulers and their citizens were not. So the resulting tensions caused Protestants and Catholic states to form alliances. Plus, foreign powers had a vested interest in these developments. The French were encircled by Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs and sought to weaken them. The Spanish hoped to retake their Dutch provinces and maintain military access along the Spanish Road, and the Protestant Scandinavian countries looked to expand their influence in northern Germany. But the immediate cause of the war can be found in Bohemia. Holy Roman Emperor Matthias died and had no heirs, so along with the Bohemian Diet elected the Catholic Ferdinand to take the throne of Hungary and Bohemia. Fearing they would lose their religious rights and preferring Frederick V of the Palatinate, Bohemian Protestants threw the representatives of Ferdinand out of the palace windows, which started the Bohemian Revolt in 1618. The rebellion was initially quite successful and soon spread to Transylvania, but besides from limited support from the Ottoman Empire, who declared war on the Habsburg ally Poland, the rebels' only real ally was Frederick of the Palatinate. So, as the rebels had little international support, Ferdinand, now the Holy Roman Emperor, was able to reclaim Bohemia after crushing the rebels at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. The Palatinate was now left by itself, so Spanish troops invading from the lowlands easily overwhelmed them in 1622, forcing Frederick to flee while his lands were confiscated. Side note, all the turmoil as well as famine and crop failures during the war saw a resurgence of witch hunts. But back to the war. Christian IV of Denmark was worried that his role as the champion of Protestantism was challenged when Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden declared war on the Polish. So, in 1625, he reignited the war to turn back the Catholic gains. However, the Habsburg forces under the generals Tilly and Wallenstein quickly routed the Danes and drove them back into Jutland. Plus, domestic problems in France and England prevented them from sending help to the Danes. So the Danes had to admit defeat in 1629, but the Protestants got a new champion a year later, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. In fact, he had been involved in the war for a couple of years after he sent troops to help the besieged Protestants in Stralsund, a town in northern Germany. The Swedes started the campaign successfully as they won many of the initial encounters. However, during the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, King Adolphus was killed in battle. The Holy Roman Empire would also suffer the loss of their two great commanders, Tilly and Wallenstein, during this phase of the fighting. Nevertheless, the war continued for another 3 years, and, as was common throughout the war, the German states were devastated. It's estimated that by the end of the war, over a third of the German population was killed, thanks in part to the brutality of the mercenary armies. Therefore, war exhaustion was high within the Holy Roman Empire. So, in 1635, the Protestant and Catholic member states agreed to make peace and end the internal fighting. But the French feared the authority given to the Habsburgs over the Empire member states. Notably, member states could now no longer make foreign alliances, and an imperial army was to be created. So Catholic France formed an alliance with Protestant Sweden and joined in this now political war. The Swedes occupied northern Germany and moved as far south as Prague, and the French took Alsace and Flanders. Meanwhile, the French also helped to start separatist rebellions in Spanish Catalonia in 1640. Elsewhere, the Habsburgs managed to gain the support of their old rival Denmark, who looked to contain their neighbour Sweden. And the French and the Swedes continued to be backed by Protestant states like the Dutch provinces and Brandenburg Prussia, but this was largely inconsequential. Both sides tried to make peace for a few years, and it wasn't until the death of Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister of France, in 1648 that it was able to be achieved. However, both Sweden, Denmark, and France and Spain would continue fighting for a few more years. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the last great religious war in Europe and is one of the most important treaties of history. It established the idea of territorial integrity, and along with the move from mercenary to professional armies, this helped form the modern-day nation-states. It also greatly upset the balance of power within Europe. Nations like Sweden and Brandenburg Prussia, who split Pomerania between them, became emergent great powers. Plus, Bourbon France expanded its borders east and became the dominant land force in Europe. The Swiss had their independence guaranteed, and the Spanish would have to recognize Dutch independence. On the other hand, the declining Spanish would go on to lose more land to the French and face rebellions in Portugal. Plus, the Holy Roman Empire finally had to recognize Calvinism and grant the states more freedom. This ultimately weakened the empire and would later encourage the Ottomans to attack Vienna.
Okay, guys, okay.
Espera, hablas inglés. Can you understand what I'm saying? And if you can...
Yes, you can. Okay, now I think we...
Can you answer me? Si has estudiado inglés antes, pero todavía no lo puedes hablar
video. Okay, this is the Council of Trent. I think we have time anyway. We'll take advantage of these 5 minutes that we have, and at least we'll start this video.
The Council of Trent was an 18-year-long series of committee meetings attended mostly by church officials and by theologians. And in principle, they came from all over the world, but in practice, they mostly came from Italy. There were 3 major purposes for the council that Pope Paul III had called. The first was to answer Protestant criticisms of the Church's teachings, which had been getting louder and louder and louder since 1518. The second purpose was to explain exactly where the Church disagreed with Protestant ideas about theology, and exactly why the Church thought Protestants were wrong and the Church was right. And along the way, the committee decided that they wanted to reform worship in ways that would make it more appealing and more meaningful to a popular audience, and reduce corruption, which was a big problem in the medieval and Renaissance church. Now, you might think that it would be difficult to get a bunch of church people to agree on fine points of theology, and you would be right if you thought that. In fact, since the Council of Trent was largely made up of representatives who had studied canon law, church law, that is, an awful lot of the participants were actually lawyers, it was even harder than you might imagine to get agreement on all of these issues. In fact, it was so difficult and so contentious that 2 more popes, Julius III and Pius IV, had to bring in a bunch of sessions during their own reigns in order to finish the committee's business. Now, I know what you're thinking. What about Pope Paul IV? Didn't he come between Julius III and Pius IV? What was he doing? Well, the fact is that Paul IV was not exactly interested in compromise. He wasn't interested in agreeing with other people because he believed very strongly in the authority of the Pope, and he also was a huge fan of the Inquisition. In fact, when he died in 1559, the crowds in Rome were so happy that they took the statue of him in the square, put it on trial for its life, chopped off its head, and threw it into the Tiber River. So anyway, the committee meetings had to wait until after he died. He didn't actually contribute then to the Council of Trent, except in holding it up for a while. Now, there are a lot of websites that focus on the theological reforms of the Council of Trent, and not very many that I can find that talk about the social and worship reforms. So that's what I'm going to focus on here. In terms of making the worship experience more meaningful, the church decided that they wanted to enforce a policy of having more churchy sounding music, of having lots of fancy church decorations, and of making sure that all the priests had a minimum education so that they would be able to at least teach actual Catholic doctrine, create a sermon, and understand Latin when they saw it. The council also did its best to eliminate pluralism, which was the practice of taking a bunch of different church jobs and paying somebody else half the salary to do them for you while you collected the other half for doing nothing. There was to be no buying and selling of church jobs. There was an actual stock market for church jobs. There would be no giving your church jobs to your friends and your family. And if you were creating, if you wanted your kids to be monks or nuns, you couldn't make them be monks or nuns. You had to wait until they were close to an adult. They had to make their own decision.
Okay, let's stop right here, guys. I have no more time, unfortunately.